Welcome, everybody, to a fresh edition of Archaeology of Connecticut. And with our expert panel, here is our state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our April episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm here with Scott Brady, my co-host, president of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, and tonight's special guest, Alec Wetzel, a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Connecticut. Tonight, we're going to talk with Alec about his ongoing dissertation research on the ecological changes that occurred in New England following European colonization in the 17th century. Alec's work uses white-tailed deer remains from archaeological sites in the late woodland and colonial periods to assess ecological changes brought about by the settlement of European colonists and the things that they began to do and the impact they had on the landscape. So we're going to discuss lots of topics, including the question of why deer populations appeared to have declined in the 17th century, even though at that time European populations weren't that high yet. We'll also discuss the potential of research on indigenous habitat management strategies for informing modern-day management of natural resources. So, as we go through the show and bring it back to the end, we'll take it up to potential implications for the present day. So before we get started talking about our topic tonight, Alec, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Scott, for having me. My name is Alec. I am working on getting my PhD at UConn as we speak. Been here for about 5 years now. Before that, got my master's from the University of Utah out in Salt Lake City. Then my bachelor's degree is from Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, where I'm originally from. And so a lot of my research that I've been doing over the last couple of years is really concerned with human ecology, as I like to think of it, kind of the relations that humans have with their environments, their natural environments and also their social environments. And these are the questions that have kind of guided my research agenda over the last decade that I've been doing archaeology up and down Eastern North America. But yeah, that's pretty much me.
Okay. Sounds really interesting. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic because it's something that I'm interested in as well. So we talked a little bit about in the intro and in our back and forth, as we were preparing for the show, about you kind of focusing on deer as a proxy for understanding ecological change. And can you tell us a little bit about why white-tailed deer are a good proxy for that?
Absolutely. In my dissertation work, I'm really interested in kind of understanding shifts in landscape use and natural resource use from kind of before European colonization to after. And a big part of that is understanding kind of how landscape ecology and the forest ecology was changing at that time. And there's been a lot of attempts over the years to kind of get at these questions. There's some good historical data and some historical studies out there about this type of stuff. There's some paleo-environmental reconstructions that have been attempted, but they haven't necessarily all been able to fully answer the question of what's going on in the landscape at this time. What's going on kind of at that 17th century transition from a kind of native managed landscape by the indigenous inhabitants of this region to one that was changed then by the European settlers in the region. And so the big question here is understanding ecological disturbance. And this is the idea that a habitat can be disturbed for a variety of reasons. The one that I'm most interested in is anthropogenic disturbance, human disturbance of an environment. And so when humans come into an area, they often modify it in a whole variety of ways. You can have a whole bunch of different impacts on the plants and animal species that you're surrounded by. And one of the big ways that humans throughout time have done this is by clearing forests, particularly with the use of fire. Burning the landscape in kind of a managed way has always been a really common thing for people to do for a variety of reasons. And so this is one of the big things that I'm interested in New England. And if you want to understand kind of past patterns of fire use by humans, the most common ways to do this are to kind of core sediment records from lakes or something and look at charcoal abundance or other types of pollen, for example. But what I'm doing instead is looking at white-tailed deer remains. And the big reason that I think this is really useful is that if anybody is kind of even passingly familiar with white-tailed deer, they know that deer really do kind of like anthropogenically disturbed habitats. They really are a very interesting species in the sense that they kind of thrive near humans in a lot of ways. You always see deer kind of foraging in agricultural fields. They're trying to cross roads. They're in backyards and whatnot. They're all over the place in Connecticut and even in eastern North America more broadly. And this is because deer really love ecological disturbance. They love these early successional habitats where kind of vegetation is growing in the area for the first time, as often happens after humans come in and will burn or clear the land. They love the margins of kind of forests and fields. And so when you plant a field of maize, corn, or whatever, deer love to hang out at that edge, that boundary between the forests and the fields. And so if you want to understand what's going on with kind of ecologically disturbed habitats, I think white-tailed deer population abundance and white-tailed deer demography is a really useful way to go about doing this.
Very cool. I think that, we see this all the time, right, with deers in people's backyards and on the roads and things like that. And I guess maybe a lot of people think of that as kind of a modern phenomenon that, they're doing it now because they have to, not so much because they want to. But, I mean, how would you kind of address that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly, a lot of the reason that we encounter wildlife often nowadays is because wildlife are being kind of forced into proximity with us. But certain species like deer, this would have always been the case. The scale of kind of the disturbance that humans have created in ecosystems now is far greater, of course, than many places in the past. But deer were always kind of interested in hanging out in these types of habitats. And so we might think of this as a recent phenomenon, kind of novel situation that's been caused by recent development. But humans have always been modifying the landscape in eastern North America and in Connecticut. And so this is always the kind of thing that would have happened. People would have come into contact with deer at the edges of their villages, at the edges of their fields, and all sorts of places like this.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, about like human modification of the landscape in the pre-contact period. I think that is a topic that's been debated a bit, particularly in recent years. For a long time, it was very well accepted based on ethnohistorical sources and other accounts that, people were doing a lot of burning to manage the landscape. That's been called into question by some people, as have sort of the entire kind of paradigm of the Native American relationship with the environment and what that actually entailed and what that meant. So would you like to talk a little bit about that and kind of just the background for that kind of research?
Absolutely. And so, this is, a long-standing series of questions in the archaeology and history of Native Americans. The kind of earliest thinking on the topic by colonists and settlers and whatnot, they recognized that Native peoples were modifying the landscape. If you read these early 17th century accounts, or even earlier accounts, Verrazano landing in Narragansett Bay in the 16th century was writing about this kind of stuff. They recognized that Native peoples were managing the landscape to some extent. They were burning seasonally once or twice a year and doing all sorts of things to manipulate their surroundings. But as kind of the colonial period went on, there was more of an emphasis on kind of spreading the story that Native peoples weren't really using the land. There was this emphasis on a sort of terra nullius argument, it's called, this idea that the land wasn't being used. It was empty. It was just natural because Native Americans weren't doing anything with it. And the reason that people were pushing this narrative, of course, is they wanted that land. And so kind of contradicting the earliest observations of what Native peoples were actually doing with the land. They were, in fact, using it quite extensively. This was an attempt to justify European settlers colonizing New England and the rest of the continent. And so then kind of as that narrative started to wane there were threads of this going well into the 20th century. But archaeologists and environmental historians began to push back against this narrative and say, no, in fact, Native peoples were absolutely managing the landscape. We've got all of these historical accounts out there of how Native peoples were burning, the different reasons they were doing it, harkening back to all of these early colonial records. And this kind of really reached its heyday in Connecticut and the surrounding areas in the 1980s. You've got famous books like Cronin's book. You've got Changes in the Land. All of these really cool historical research was going on. And so this was kind of the dominant thinking then for the past couple of decades. But in recent years, with kind of the advent of strongly scientific methods from paleoclimatologists, people who study pollen cores from lake sediments and things like that, there's been a lot of questions about that, because while the historical data clearly suggests that Native Americans were definitely burning the landscape, it's written down, it's recorded, it was observed, there's not a lot of evidence for it in the lake sediments and the pollen cores from this region. And that kind of begs a lot of questions as to what exactly was going on. I mean, are the historical records wrong? Was it more localized and smaller scale than we might have previously thought? There's a lot of unanswered questions still, despite the fact that this is a topic that people have been discussing for hundreds of years.
You know, it seems to me that this idea of that the Native people aren't, the land is lying fallow, basically, while they're here, is also kind of in line with that whole Eurocentric idea that these people didn't have as sophisticated a society. You know, that they didn't recognize or intentionally ignored the fact that there were these complex interactions with their environments.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all wrapped up in this kind of conceptualization of Native Americans as part of nature, and Europeans are culture. They are civilized. They are humanity. They're something different than Native peoples. It's a really, just a horrible narrative that was pushed for a long time. And, of course, it's clearly erroneous. And so that kind of legacy of this conversation is really important to keep in mind as we're having these conversations in the present. Right? You want to make sure that you're not arguing that anything even remotely close to these old colonialist ideas about Native Americans.
Yeah, and it draws on a lot, I think, about, cultural differences between the two groups that then Europeans used to kind of justify their colonization and takeover, things like, not putting up fences and bounding your property, your land, your crops. Meaning that, if it's just open space, then it's doesn't belong to anybody. Anybody can take it. Anybody can use it. If my pigs happen to go forage in there and eat all of your crops, it's your own fault because you didn't have a fence and you should have known better.
Didn't put up a fence, exactly. There's really there's so many layers to this kind of topic, because it really does, at this fundamental level, go back to these differences in political systems and in understandings of who owns land, who owns the rights to land, who owns the resources on the land. And that looks very different between Europeans and Native peoples. I mean, if you read these early accounts, what Europeans are describing, they're kind of struggling to find the words to describe a very different political and economic and social system than what they're used to. These native groups in New England, all these different Algonquian societies, I mean, their understanding of land ownership was a lot more communal than Europeans was. And so this issue of kind of, is your land fenced in or not, comes from a very European notion of land ownership and property rights, that you own this land, it is yours, you put a fence up around it, you enclose it, and it is now kind of yours and your descendants forever. And that's not really how a lot of native groups in New England work, and how a lot of indigenous peoples around the world understand land ownership. It's a lot more communal. The land it's a commons. It's a thing that everybody has certain rights to and certain access to. And that's kind of privatization of these notions. It's a very European way of thinking. that was in stark contrast to how a lot of native groups were understanding things, because their land use, their agriculture, their farming looked so different than Europeans. I mean, they weren't clearing a square plot of land of trees and fencing it in and kind of planting a single crop across it. I mean, they were multi-cropping. There were still trees interspersed around. It was just a very different system that was foreign to what Europeans were used to.
And a very effective system, I may add, for the people, for the native people that were here. I mean, it had served them very well for an extended period of time.
Absolutely. The Europeans have tried so hard, and they do this all the time. I mean, there's stories of European missionaries, even just in recent years, going to indigenous groups and trying to get them to farm in a European style. And it doesn't take hold in a lot of cases. It's just, you need to understand that certain people, I mean, if these people have been living in this land for 12,500 years or more, they understand the land pretty well, and they know what's going to work, what's not going to work, and what kind of the best things to do to feed their population is. And so imposing some external strategy is not always a particularly well-informed thing to do.
Yeah. So we know that, when Europeans got here in the 17th century, indigenous people were clearly, I mean, we were just talking about this, they were clearly managing the land in terms of farming, right? Because at this time period, they were fairly substantial farms associated with their larger villages, which were mostly in the river valleys and along the coast at this time.
Yes.
And, people debate the intensity of that farming and, how long people had been farming at that scale prior to the arrival of Europeans, and whether or not the changes brought about by the Europeans' arrival and settlement, contributed to the intensification of that or whatever. But that's like an ongoing debate. But, there's clear evidence that people were growing food for hundreds of years before Europeans arrived at some level or another. So clearly they're managing the landscape in that sense. But what about in earlier periods before farming was widespread, when people were more living a gathering, fishing, hunting kind of way of life? I mean, did indigenous people live just passively off the land, or were they actively managing the landscape, to promote certain plants and animals even in the deeper past?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question as well, and one that becomes difficult to answer at a certain point. Because certainly we think about kind of the biggest land management projects that were going on for even indigenous peoples, are related to farming and food production. Once you start farming, you've really got to do more stuff to the land in a lot of cases. But that's not the only reason that you modify the land. I mean, even the early European settlers in New England were writing about how it wasn't even necessarily for the purposes of farming that native peoples were burning and clearing the land. It promoted the abundance of certain animal species like deer, who really like that kind of habitat. It promotes the abundance of certain plant species. There are certain fruit trees and shrubs and things like that love that sort of habitat. And so native peoples have really always been doing this. It's always been a strategy for them to modify the landscape. This dichotomy between foraging for wild foods and producing your own domesticated food, it can be a bit misleading in this context and in a lot of other contexts as well. It's all part of this continuum of managing your environment, managing your landscape and your resource use in a whole variety of ways. And that continuum, I think, is what's really interesting about these questions. Now, in New England, we don't know with a lot of certainty exactly how people were doing this deeper into the past. We've got the early kind of colonial records of how people were managing the landscape. And it's probably safe to extrapolate from those that even thousands of years ago, people would have been burning and clearing, not for maize farming, for corn farming, but for other reasons. And we certainly know that was the case in other parts of eastern North America. There's a lot of pollen charcoal records from the southeast, where I've done a lot of work as well, showing that even like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, they're starting to burn the landscape to an appreciable degree that it seems like this was inspired by kind of resource management strategies that people are undertaking. And of course, even just beyond burning the landscape, native peoples are constructing fish weirs and traps. They're doing all sorts of things to the land, these kind of modifications to make the land more productive for them in a whole variety of ways. So there's becomes less and less evidence at a certain point, but I think it's certainly most plausible that this was always a strategy for people.
Mm-hmm. And I think you can draw on the archaeological record for some indirect evidence of land management strategies for, particularly in regards to food and thinking about a very clear reliance on mast resources or nuts in the Archaic period, where, we're finding a lot of different nut species in great quantities on archaeological sites where they have preserved through being charred and things like that, and in features and hearths and things like that, but also storage pits and tools that are well kind of suited for processing those types of food, which suggests that, if nuts were that important, we know that they're kind of a irregular crop in some ways, that there are better years than others for mass resources, but it sort of suggests that people were probably trying to promote them to increase, the crops of those very important and nutritious resources that they apparently relied on.
Absolutely. There's a lot of great data on that, too, from out west, California, in terms of kind of acorn processing and management of acorn groves. There's really great work showing that this has always been really a long-standing strategy for Native peoples to engage in. It's super cool to think about.
Yeah, and honestly, I can say from my, experience in New England on sites where we have features from the pre-contact period, of all periods, going all the way back to the oldest sites, if you have preserved plant remains in a hearth, there's almost always nuts in every period. So it's clearly a long-standing food resource.
Yeah.
So what about, and this is kind of a little bit off topic, but just, I think part of the debate about this is that, there's a scientific approach to studying these things, and then there's this romantic idea about indigenous people and their relationship to nature, and that it kind of has colored some of that past research. That, they live in harmony with nature, they're one with the land, they understand it at a different level and better than Europeans do, and maybe, that's not accurate, or maybe it's colored kind of some of the research in the past. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue that archaeologists and everybody needs to grapple with, really, because we don't want to be treating Native peoples like some sort of the noble savage trope, that these are people who are at one with nature in perfect harmony, living a sort of Pocahontas Disney version lifestyle, painting with all the colors of the wind, The Native peoples are people too. They are people who very clearly had probably superior understandings of sustainability and sustainable resource use than a lot of Europeans did at the time and even into the present. But they're people nonetheless, and they're managing their landscape. They're using these resources in a way that people do, probably with a better eye towards conservation and sustainable resource use, but people nonetheless. And so this kind of the idea that we need to be doing, there's an issue with painting these stories, these anecdotes, these kind of narratives of native resource use as this Disney Channel a concept that they're at harmony with nature and everything. But it's possible to recognize the aspects of native society that were kind of better in line with principles of ecology as we understand them. It's possible to kind of recognize that they were often more sustainable in a lot of ways. I think that's perfectly legitimate when thinking about these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that shows a much greater sophistication in understanding how to farm productively and sustainably. Kind of the opposite of that whole narrative that some of us have heard over the years of they did not manage the landscape, and the noble savage kind of idea, as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it has really interesting implications, too, for their relationship with animals and kind of hunting practices over time, because, there's a lot of prescriptions and things that you're supposed to do when you're hunting in ways that people were supposed to treat animals and dispose of them and treat their carcasses and things like that, that, are given kind of a ritual status and are tied in with like religion and cosmology and those types of issues. But at the same time, if you look at those from sort of an anthropological perspective, you can see kind of in many ways like a sustainability ethic kind of built into those practices, where they kind of like, can they put the brakes on things and like make people think about it and be careful, and not take too much and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. There's kind of this divide between resource use and sustainability to a lot of us who have kind of grown up with a Western kind of Euro-American way of thinking. That we think that using resources is inherently destructive. You're inherently extracting things from the planet. And that sustainability then is something you need to do to counteract that process. But that kind of is a false dichotomy that would be foreign to a lot of non-Euro-American cultures from the past and the present even, and certainly to a lot of Native and Indigenous peoples. That dichotomy wouldn't exist. Resource use is inherently sustainable for them in a lot of ways. It's this whole broader package of how your society and how your economy and everything functions, that these are one and the same. It's not something, sustainability is not something that you do to counteract your resource use. Conservation is not something you have to do to counteract your economics. It's all part of the same package. It is inherently sustainable. It is inherently conservation.
Yeah, and really, like on a large scale, that type of behavior is adaptive. It helps you succeed. It helps you have enough food to eat and all of those types of things. So absolutely. Total sense. So let's talk about deer. That's what I want to talk about. So, you didn't really mention it in your introduction, but you do have a background as a zooarchaeologist as well, which is the study of animal bones from archaeological sites. So I can see where that, would tie into this research. But so you've been looking at, and I know you said that you're not done with these analyses, but would you mind kind of talking about your, your literature review that you've gone back through past assemblages and just what you've seen and the material that you've looked at so far about, white-tailed deer and the hunting of white-tailed deer in the, pre-contact period?
For sure. Yeah, so as you said, Sarah, I'm not done with my own analyses yet, and so there's a lot that I can't say definitively, but I can give you my overall impressions for what I'm seeing in kind of the broader region in terms of deer abundance and the use of white-tailed deer. And so it seems to me that New England is a case that's a little bit different from other parts of North America. And so I think I should start with kind of contextualizing what's going on with deer across the continent. Because right before Europeans show up, there's evidence that deer populations were actually kind of stressed or depleted, depressed, you can say, in a lot of regions. In California, in the Southwest, in Texas, there have been studies by zooarchaeologists showing that deer populations had probably declined throughout kind of the pre-colonial period. And so that on the eve of European colonization, there might not have been as many deer as there once were in those areas. And the interesting thing is then once Europeans show up in California and in the Southwest and those types of places, the kind of demographic collapse that native peoples experience reduces the hunting pressure on deer. At least this is what people are arguing. And that because there are fewer people hunting the deer once European diseases and warfare and genocide kind of occur, the deer populations rebound. And there's data from the Southwest and California in particular showing that mule deer, in this case, not whitetail, are rebounding in those regions in kind of the early years of European colonization. And so this is kind of the broader picture that I was faced with when coming to New England to do this work on deer. But what I'm seeing at the moment is actually kind of the opposite, and it's a bit perplexing in certain ways. It seems to me like deer weren't really that depressed in the late woodland period and kind of the centuries prior to European colonization. It looks to me like there were quite a few deer around. And there's even some evidence that there were more deer in the late woodland period than there were in prior periods, which might have to do with kind of the horticultural activities that are going on at the time. But if there is more landscape management in the late woodland period associated with maize horticulture, that might be why there are more deer in that period, assuming that these results are all confirmed by my own studies. And so, yeah, it looks to me like this is a bit of the opposite pattern that we're seeing in a lot of other areas, that there are lots of deer before Europeans show up. And then in the 17th century, when we would expect kind of this environmental rebound to happen, it doesn't in New England. I've got some preliminary data that seems to suggest that deer populations actually decline in the 17th century, and they do so quite rapidly, which is really fascinating, especially put in the context of what's going on in the broader regions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in terms of archaeologically, from the deer remains from the sites that you're going to look at or that you're currently looking at, how are you kind of addressing this question with the archaeological data?
Yeah, so this is one of the tricky things that we as zooarchaeologists have to do, kind of reconstructing the demography of an animal species from hundreds or perhaps thousands of years ago based just on the bones that are left for us to find. And so in terms of my research with the deer, you can look at just simply the abundance of deer remains in a site. That's kind of a rough approximation of how many deer might have been on the landscape in a lot of time periods. And the reason this works well for deer is that deer are such a high priority kind of prey species. Because they are so large, they're one of the largest species that were commonly taken, you can get a lot of bang for your buck, no pun intended, by hunting a deer. It's a lot of calories. And so deer are pretty much always taken if you encounter one out when you're hunting. And so for this reason, you can pretty much expect that the abundance of deer in an archaeological site is more or less going to correlate, roughly at least, to its kind of abundance on the larger landscape out there at the time. But beyond just the simple kind of abundance of deer bones in a site, there's other things you can look at. There's a lot of research showing that deer body size has actually got a known relationship to deer population size. And the idea, this is really well established in Texas and some other places, that when deer populations are large, that means there's a lot of deer competing for limited food on the landscape. And so because you're splitting that food up between a larger population, the body size of those deer is probably going to be a bit smaller. In contrast, if you've got a small deer population, that means there's more food to go around, so those deer can grow larger. And so what I can do when I'm doing my kind of zooarchaeological analysis is measure certain bones of the deer skeleton to approximate their body size. And that actually tells me something about how large their population might have been, which is a really cool kind of trick to be able to do.
Yeah, that is really cool.
Yeah. There's some other things that you can do. I mean, you can look at the age structure of the population. So certain bones in your body will fuse at certain ages. And so if you find an unfused one, you know that individual was younger than the age at which it fuses. If you find a fused bone, you know they were older than that age. You can look at the wear patterns on teeth, which is a common way for even hunters to approximate the age of a deer that they kill. You can look at the teeth and kind of match it up to known patterns of wear and how worn down the crowns of the teeth are. And so looking at the age structure of the population can also tell you something. Generally, a larger or a growing population will have more juvenile individuals and a population that's kind of under hunting stress that tends to go after more of the adult individuals. So it tends to look more juvenile dominated when you've got kind of more hunting pressure on the population. And so even looking at these things about the age of the deer that you're finding in the archaeological site can really clue you in as to what's going on with their population size.
So do you have any preliminary results from your analysis that you want to share, or do you want to, we'll hold off on that for now.
Yeah. Let's break some news here on ICRB Radio. Let's.
So there's not much that I can tell you at this point because I've been spending all my time looking at kind of a site from the late woodland period, but I haven't yet got data from a 17th century comparison site. But I can tell you that the deer that I'm finding in this late woodland site, these are some big deer, which is really interesting to me. I mean, these are some of the biggest antlers, some of the biggest deer bones that I have encountered in the last 10 years that I've been doing archaeology. So I don't quite know what to make of it yet. I need to get more of the full picture here, but there's a lot of deer in this assemblage, and they're really big. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I could say qualitatively speaking, because I don't have measurements at hand or whatever, just sort of my perception, some of the 17th century sites that I've looked at in the last couple of years, I've also noticed the deer. They're certainly much, much bigger than the ones I have in my comparative collection.
Yeah.
Which seems really to be
a broader pattern. And the trick is then going to be, because if I'm seeing some big deer in the late woodland period, you're seeing some big deer in the 17th century. I'd like to know if are the 17th century ones a little bit smaller? Are they a little bit bigger even? I mean, these are all things that can clue me in as to what's going on with deer body size changes that then clue me in as to what's going on with deer demography. So this is really going to be a key thing to look into to figure out what's going on here. I need some nice 17th century comparison points.
Yeah, it might be interesting. Oh, sorry, Scott.
Yeah, no problem. How are you selecting the sites that you want to analyze? Has there been any process, or right now are you just searching and trying to find those that have a higher concentration of deer bones than maybe some of the others?
Yeah, so I started off looking for sites that just had lots of deer. I need a big sample size to be able to do a lot of this stuff. And I eventually settled on a pair of sites that I want to analyze. And so what I've been looking at for the past year now is the deer bones from the Morgan site, which is a late woodland farming village, really, on the Connecticut River right outside of Hartford. And so this is kind of my pre-colonial baseline for what the deer population might have looked like. And it's especially useful because it's got early evidence for maize farming at this site. And so there is probably going to be some landscape modification occurring in the area. And then because the Morgan site is actually right across the river, more or less, from the Hollister site, I was hoping that once I finish up this one, I'll be looking at the Hollister site deer as kind of a 17th century kind of colonial period data point to understand what's going on with the deer.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of deer bones there, so that might be a very good choice.
Yeah, I was thinking, we haven't really gotten into the material at length yet, but there are, I think we're going to find at Hollister that we have fairly clearly distinguishable deposits from, like, say, the 1660s, 50s, 60s, and also, like, the 1680s, 90s, like the later part. So that might be interesting to see. I don't know if there's deer in the later ones, but, it could offer even just a very, like, short-term change kind of look at things. We'll have to see.
Yeah, that would be ideal for sure, because so I've also been working to kind of reconstruct what the human populations in the 17th century might have looked like, and it certainly seems like you've got several 100,000 people, native people, in the year 1600, and Europeans are really showing up in force in kind of the 1620s and 30s and 40s, and their population is growing, but it's nowhere near what the native population was before European colonization began. And so this time period, kind of in the 1640s, 50s, and 60s, seems to be the low point for overall human population in New England. Mm-hmm. And by the time you're getting into kind of the 1670s and 80s and 90s, Europeans are just showing up in huge numbers, that by the time you hit 1700 AD, you've pretty much returned to a pre-colonial human population size in the region. And so I really need to zero in on these 17th century sites to figure out what's going on with this kind of demographic shift and what's going on with the landscape use as a result of that.
Does it complicate things for you, or do you think it's more helpful that, once you start to see that European presence in the mid-1600s, they're rapidly changing the landscape. They're clear cutting, building walls, and plotting it on a map and saying it belongs to someone. So do you think that helps your ability to look at that, or does it add some additional hurdles for you?
So it's certainly giving me some really clear landscape management to assess kind of how deer are responding to that. In terms of specifically kind of understanding most of the questions that I'm interested in, it's a bit more of a hurdle because there's so many different things, so many different processes are introduced by European colonization that it's adding a lot of variables to the analysis. Because they are clearing the landscape in such huge numbers. And so one of the big things that I'm concerned about is that when you're clearing forests on a kind of relatively smaller scale, like native peoples were probably doing, that might promote deer abundance, creating all of these nice edge habitat areas, these forest and field margins. Deer love that. But if you take that too far, then the deer populations can crash. And so creating too much forest clearance is also not good for the deer. You kind of need that sweet spot. They don't like closed forest, and they don't like purely open landscape. You need the intermediary. And that's what I think native peoples were probably doing. But by the time you get the real European land clearance in kind of the 18th century, for sure, that is probably going to be further kind of contributing to deer population declines.
So you mentioned that, there's a lot of factors involved, particularly once Europeans are here en masse and they're doing all kinds of things. What do you think about the introduction of, huge numbers of domesticated animals to the landscape and the impact of that on deer populations? Do you think it's a factor?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting consideration. Certainly there's a lot of great research out there on all of the different ramifications of livestock introduction to New England. We know that Europeans are kind of letting their livestock roam quite freely in a lot of cases, which has led to a lot of conflict between native peoples and Europeans. I think the biggest impact of European livestock on kind of the research that I'm doing is going to be the fact that if you've got pigs or cattle or whatever right outside your house, you're not going to be always feeling that pressure to go hunt deer. It's kind of this replacement that why would you spend a couple hours going out there trying to find a deer to bring home when you've got a similarly sized animal that you've got right outside? And of course, you can't just kill all of the cattle that you've got or all the pigs that you got. But there's a whole bunch of different economic trade-offs that people are then facing with the introduction of livestock that are probably going to be impacting just how often people are hunting deer in some cases. And this isn't to say that they're not hunting deer anymore. We know that from your work at the Hollister site. You've got livestock there, and you still got a lot of deer. So this kind of frontier homes that these European colonists are living in, they're still foraging for kind of wild foods, just like the indigenous inhabitants of the region are.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And in Hollister, the odd thing is that they seem to be eating a lot of their domesticated animals. They seem to be eating a lot more deer, at least from the parts of the site that I've looked at more intensively, which is kind of interesting. Which may, be related to trying to grow those herds and things like that. But
yeah, and that could be an indication that. Sorry.
I'm sorry, their own sustainability practices in terms of their own herds of animals.
Indeed. Yeah, and what you're finding there might be evidence for the fact that maybe the introduction of livestock isn't really that, it's not really going to change the patterns that I'm looking to see in the deer. If they're still going after the deer when you've got livestock, maybe it's not as big of a deal as we might think.
So we talked about hunting a bit in terms of with the argument that if Europeans have domesticated animals, they're sizable, they provide a lot of meat, they're a much easier thing to kill and eat. They do have guns, which of course by this point native people do as well, and they've had them for a while. But what other things do you think could potentially impact deer populations? Like we talked a little bit about, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit. We think about the fur trade in this part of the country as primarily being, fur-bearing animals like beaver and the kind of warm, fuzzy fur animals, but the cute ones. Deer hides, though. Deer hides, though, are important, right? Because people are making clothing out of them. They're important for like gloves and mittens and that kinds of things, which are important for New England winters. What kind of impact do you think? I mean, is there like a good indication that once Europeans arrive and, are deer part of this fur and hide trade?
Yeah, so this is a big question, because if up until this point, right, I've been arguing that I think deer populations in the 17th century in New England are declining because of landscape management changes. I think that native peoples are no longer burning. I think they're no longer clearing as much as they once were, and so there's less high-quality deer habitat in the 17th century. The added complication, as Scott brought up, of European land clearance then really destroying a lot of deer habitat, kind of the other end of the spectrum, is contributing to a decline in the deer population in the 17th century. Making this ecological argument, though, this kind of environmental structure argument, is complicated by the fur trade. We know that in the southeast, for example, the fur trade for deer skins, for kind of the buckskin trade, was huge. I mean, astronomical numbers of deer hides were being taken from the Carolinas, from Virginia, from other states in the southeast, and shipped back to Europe. This was a huge aspect of the fur trade in the southeast. And so it's possible that if it's similarly important in New England, that the declines that I'm seeing in the deer population in the 17th century could be due to these new hunting pressures for the fur trade. People aren't necessarily hunting the deer to eat it per se, but because of the kind of financial gain, the profit that you can make from selling skins back to Europe. And so the fur trade in New England, based on my reading of the historical accounts and the literature and some of the archaeological work that's been done, I am not sure that deer were quite as important a species in the New England fur trade as they were in the southeastern fur trade. I've scoured the 17th century accounts for mentions of deer, and when you encounter these kind of, for mentions of other animals as well, and when you encounter these lists of kind of the fur-bearing animals that people were going after, they list beaver. I mean, first of all, beaver was the number one thing that people were going after in the fur trade. So those always get mentioned when people are talking about furs and things in the 17th century. They bring up fox, mink, martens, otters. These are kind of the common things that get listed. From what I've seen of the 17th century documents, though, they really don't list deer as one of these species that people are going after. It's not something that gets mentioned. And there was one really interesting account, I want to say it was in Winthrop wrote about it maybe. But the idea, what was mentioned was that native peoples would give you 2 beaver pelts in exchange for 1 good deer pelt. And this was a really interesting little anecdote that I found, because it tells me that deer were not really what the Europeans wanted. They were willing to even give up deer hides that they had in order to get the beaver pelts, which is what they really cared about for these fur trade dynamics. And so it's entirely possible that deer were important in the fur trade in New England. I can't rule it out, but I'm not sure that they're as important as we might think they were, and I don't think they were nearly as important as they were in the Southeast.
Yeah, I'm familiar more. So I'm from New York, not far from the town of Gloversville, right, which is named after like the leather industry in that area. And this is like a much later kind of thing where people were getting deer from the Adirondacks and Pennsylvania, and as they were like moving farther west and sending them back to fuel the leather industry. But you don't read much about it in the colonial period.
Yeah.
In the Northeast so much. Although, people had things like leather breeches and things like that.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem like it was it didn't drive a massive, economy like it did in the Southeast.
Yeah, and so it's possible that...
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to say, it seems to me that kind of shows the value of those deer hides to the native. 2 beavers for a deer, that's a pretty good deal. That must have been, do you think that's because there's pressure on them? I mean, obviously they're using these for clothing and everything. Do you think it's because they're becoming scarcer on the landscape? Or do you have any idea or any thoughts on that exchange?
Yeah, it's entirely possible that that's what's happening. Part of what we're kind of struggling to interpret here, this might be actually that maybe deer hides were valuable, but they were valuable locally, and that the Europeans didn't need them from New England. They were getting them from the southeast or elsewhere. And so they weren't being shipped back to Europe in New England, but that doesn't mean that deer weren't still being used, their hides weren't still being used locally in the region. It's also possible, as you say, Scott, that because deer are becoming less abundant on the landscape, these pelts are worth a lot. I mean, in the 17th century, 2 beaver pelts, that's not chump change. I mean, that's legitimate.
Right.
And, I mean, we certainly know that these certain areas, I mean, there's Portsmouth, Rhode Island instituted a closed deer hunting season in like 1642 or something like that. I mean, we know that deer are becoming scarce pretty early on in the 17th century. And so, this changing value of the species and the changing value of deer pelts is absolutely an important consideration here.
So, I mean, we're actually kind of closing in on the last 10 minutes or so of the show. It always goes by really fast.
It does.
But maybe we could spend a little bit of time kind of talking about, the implications of this for resource management in the present day, and just kind of thinking about sustainability and the types of things that, encourage or, result in the decline of different populations of animals.
Yeah, I think there's so many lessons that we can take from studying kind of the occurrences of European colonization that are really applicable to the present. Because all of this stuff that I've been describing, right, the fact that we've got a probably more sustainable native system of resource use, and then Europeans show up, and within a couple decades, the deer population is collapsing. And of course, we didn't even talk about the beaver population, but the beaver population is collapsing too. I mean, these are resources that native peoples have been using for thousands of years, and they were always there. But within a couple of decades of Europeans showing up, they're not there anymore. That's huge. And I think it's especially interesting because, as I was saying, the overall human population of New England in the 17th century was lower than it was prior. And so this extirpation of deer and beaver and these other things, that's not a demographic pressure necessarily. It's an economic one, perhaps. It's the shifting patterns of landscape management that are inspired by the economics of the region. It's the shifting patterns of kind of perhaps the fur trade and the use of these animals, inspired by this broader network, this transatlantic trade that you've now got in this kind of early European capitalist economy. You're integrating New England into this European kind of global economic system, and that's what's really driving this shift. And so what we're seeing here is a shift from a sustainable, kind of locally oriented economy to a very kind of exploitative, extractive one that's a lot less sustainable and a lot more globally oriented. And I think that there's parallels to the present, right? That European economy from the 17th century, that kind of early capitalist kind of global scale exchange of resources, buying some cheap furs in New England, shipping them back to Europe, manufacturing them into a hat and selling it for a profit. That's the early years of kind of our current global economic system. And we're still extracting resources at a rate that's not sustainable. We're still exploiting the environment and people all over the world for these economic endeavors. And so we understand that this 17th century New England is kind of one of the roots of this current system that we've still got. And if we want to kind of push back against climate change, and if we want to kind of institute more sustainable practices, I think that there's a lot we can learn from looking to kind of what native peoples were doing in this region prior to the 17th century. I mean, they had these sustainable management systems of how they were manipulating the landscape with fire, of even how they understood property rights, as we were talking about, right? Perhaps conceptualizing access to resources a little bit differently, not viewing the environment as a commodity, but viewing it in a different way. Maybe these are some of the answers that we can implement to kind of try to counteract some of the climate change that we're facing today and some of the environmental degradation.
Yeah, I think, it's an important thing to note, too, in all of this discussion that, Native people got involved in this capitalist system, with the fur trade and things like that, and they began to hunt beaver and other fur-bearing animals in unsustainable, very extractive ways, helping to hunt them to extinction because they were far more skilled at doing it than the European trappers were, particularly the beginning. So, the system kind of sucked everybody in.
Yeah, it's such a powerful thing to have occurred that Native peoples, they couldn't escape it. If your whole world is changing so drastically in these early years of colonization, that if you're a talented hunter, a talented trapper, you gotta feed your family, you gotta feed your tribe, you gotta take part in this system, unfortunately. And they probably recognized that what they were doing wasn't sustainable because, again, as we've discussed, this whole world view that a lot of indigenous peoples have is just inherently a lot more sustainable. They don't even need to think about it being sustainable. And so I'm sure they recognized what was going on, and I'm sure that was a horrible decision to have to make to participate in this kind of extractive resource use when they knew kind of the ultimate outcome and what that might look like.
It's kind of interesting to think, too, of the impact it might have had on people who were doing this maybe instead of engaging in some of the activities they normally would have been doing. Just kind of changing the whole way of life and the way that you interacted with the environment and the things that you did with your time. So it's sort of interesting.
Absolutely.
Hey, Alec, is anyone doing anything comparable to this academic pursuit in with other species?
I know people have done some stuff with beavers, kind of in northern New England, Canada area, but a lot of the work that's been done on the kind of questions that I'm asking is done by historians. And so they're really relying heavily on historical records, historical accounts. And those are all, that's great. I'm relying a lot on those too. But there's not a lot of people doing this with archaeological data and kind of more broader ecological data, at least to my knowledge.
And what timeline before we let we wind things down? What's the timeline? How many more years of this do you have to do before we can come back to ICRV Radio and break some news?
That's a very good question. Give me a year, and I think I'll have the full story for you.
Hey, before
we'll have you back when you do.
Exactly. Hey, before we wind down, can everybody? We'll start with Alec and then Scott, and then we'll end with our state archaeologist. Can you briefly remind our listeners how they can find, follow, get in touch with you, and what platforms you might be on, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, my name is Alec Weitzel. That's ELICWEITZEL. I've got a website that you can find. You can find me on UConn's website as well, our anthropology department. You can follow me on Twitter. All of those options are great ways to get in touch with me.
Yeah, Scott Brady with FOSA. You can follow FOSA at FOSA-CT.org. FOSA-CT.org. We're also on Facebook. And Al, thanks for coming on. This was really interesting.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, and finally, the Office of State Archaeology, you can find us at osa.uconn.edu, and we also have an Office of State Archaeology Facebook page if you'd like to follow us there. And yeah, Alec, thanks. This was a great discussion.
Great topic for
a lot of fun, Sarah.
Great topic for the month that has Earth Day. I think we should actually have a petition out there to make it Earth Month, or even longer. But great topic, and Alec, we so appreciate you. This program is powered by our friends at the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. So thank you to all your colleagues, Scott and Sarah. As always, it's fantastic for the journey to continue. Archaeology of Connecticut here on ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley where we make local matter. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.